So a little bit of background talking about stormwater management. There are some solutions that we'll talk through. Across your county, across your HOA or your home, there are many different types of stormwater solutions. So some contractors might talk about using more infrastructure that's maybe more conventional. So that might just be piping the water and getting it away from the home, from the foundation, and just rerouting that water. A bunch of these stormwater practices that we're going to be talking about here, where they're appropriate, we have wide-ranging different types of soils and other site constraints. So it might be hard to include some of these things in your landscape. But we're going to talk about where we can use some of these green stormwater practices. So they're focusing on infiltrating that stormwater, so the water coming off of your hard surfaces like your roof, coming through your gutters and those downspouts. Can we take that water and put it back into the ground, have it soak in, and then be recharging our groundwater system. Again, some areas more soils are suitable for other things. We'll also talk about conservation landscaping, which is using native plants, which if you're familiar with the Plant Nova Natives campaign and their amazing website, they have many different resources out there to help you get started with native plants. So what is a watershed? Just to start off, background information. So we all live within a watershed, depending. So a watershed is an area of land that drains to a common body of water. So I like to think of describing the bathtub analogy. If you turn the water on in the shower, it's going all over the place in the tub, but eventually it's all draining and exiting through the drain. So no matter where that water is following, it's all taking all the soap and all the other stuff that falls into that tub into one spot and draining. So that's how you can think about a watershed. It's important to understand watersheds because they connect us all. So everything we do on the land affects our water and our water quality, because all of that land does drain. Everything that we do on that land drains through to one common area. So it kind of drains and concentrates all of that stuff. So if we use fertilizer, herbicides, or pesticides on the landscape, if there's oils and other heavy metals from cars, all of those things do eventually find their way. If we don't pick up our pet waste properly, we have some slides. So again, the definition: an area of land that drains to a stream, marsh, or other body of water. So everyone's got a watershed address. Here's an example, a map again. For the most part, this is the Fairfax County area, Arlington, City of Alexandria, Fairfax City included. So it shows the breakdowns of where those watersheds are. So these are some boundaries of the more major watersheds: Powhatan Creek, Accotank Creek, Difficult Run. Each of those watersheds can be broken down into smaller and smaller parts for those little feeder streams. So, but these are kind of the main categories that we talk about when we break down. So for an example here, for one spot where we are, Accotank Creek, which eventually does drain to the Potomac River. So you can say you're in the Accotank Creek watershed. You can also say you're within the Potomac River watershed. Then eventually we get to Chesapeake Bay and then the ocean. So these watersheds are sort of nested inside each other. So you can say you're as small as a local stream, or even up to within the Atlantic Ocean watershed. This is a great schematic from City of Alexandria. I just referenced a few of these things, but different sources of pollutants in our that could end up in our waterways. So things we do on the land, if we don't pick up after our pet waste, if we don't pick up, trash or litter, if we over fertilize, if the car is leaking or other things like that. All of those things, what happens on the land ends up draining through our stormwater system. So you can see that great, actually this is one thing I didn't check. Margaret, if I move my mouse around, can people see the area that I'm pointing to on the screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so this grate is a part of our stormwater system. So our stormwater systems, for the most part, everything that goes into these grates where we might see swales along the roadside, all of these go straight into our streams. They do not go to the same place. For the most part, internally, most of us are on, some people might be on septic systems where your home waste goes. Can you still hear me? For some reason, the audio sounds a little bit different.
Yes, I can.
Okay, not sure what's happening. So from the homes, when you use the sink, flush the toilet, all of that goes into our sanitary sewer system. So that's a separate system of pipes, and all of that goes to treatment plants to get really well treated. Our stormwater system is a separate system of pipes than that sanitary system. And those are discharging into our streams and our waterways. That's why we need to be so careful to clean up what's happening on the land around us, because there's that direct connection into our waterways. So what might happen if we don't keep our, reduce the amount of pollutants on the land if we're not cleaning up? You can get different types of environmental impacts, both on your water quality and the quantity of water. So the quality of water, we're talking about it's being impacted by those pollutants. You might get fish kills or algal blooms, all those things from excessive fertilizer use or other issues with algae. Water quantity as well. If we have too much water moving into our stormwater system and moving into our streams, that can also have an environmental impact. So if you see this lower right-hand corner, the stream is pretty eroded. So its banks are undercut, and because we have an issue with the water quantity. So the more and more we put up homes, we pave have our streets, our sidewalks, more hard surfaces all lead to a greater quantity of stormwater runoff. So in our suburban areas and our urban areas, we have a really high amount of those hard surfaces or impervious surfaces that all generate stormwater runoff, because when the precipitation happens, water cannot soak into those areas. So we can see these impacts on our streams. Can also have damage to public and or private properties, everything from basement flooding to erosion. Many of you did send pictures. Thank you. Hopefully we'll get to those at the end. Like we said, Margaret, we've got a little bit more time than the hour. So if people want to stay on, if they have the time, we'll talk through those individual pictures and issues. But things like ponding water in the yard, but all the way up until actually damage to the home and the foundation and basement flooding. So as I talked about at the start, there are some conventional solutions. These are more the capture it in a pipe and move it away quickly. Not saying that these are wrong. These are the typically used solutions, but now we're trying to think a little bit more about adding in the infiltration. So instead of just taking the water off our property, pushing it to somebody else to have to deal with, let's try and be responsible stewards and capture our stormwater as best we can and reuse it or let it soak into our properties. So common solutions that you might see around homes or your communities that are these conventional solutions are just downspout extensions. So burying, connecting it to a corrugated pipe, burying it, moving that water away from the foundation, which is always a great idea. You don't really want to have that water discharging within about 10 feet, especially 10 feet if you have like an underground foundation. It can be closer if you don't have any subgrade structures, basements or things. But generally, rule of thumb, we say is about 10 feet from the basement is a safe place to discharge stormwater. French drains are another commonly used solution. I've heard French drains kind of used as a term, sort of a catch-all, when stormwater contractors are talking about them. So sometimes these solutions, the downspout extension, which is just taking a solid pipe and moving it away for the most part, sometimes those are talked about as French drains. It can be hard, you can ask clarifying questions to really try and understand what your contractors are talking about when they say a French drain. There's many different sort of solutions that go into it. So trying to understand the solution. So here what we're referencing to a French drain, they're commonly used to try and capture water from low-lying areas. These are catch basins or boxes with grates on them that are connected to pipes. So these pipes in a French drain system are perforated. So we have this rock to try and prevent the movement of that soil to clog up these perforated pipes. But the French drains move the water. They're trying to drain the surrounding soils, soak it into the pipe and move it away, again, for any low-lying wet spots. These solutions are typically used. Catch basins I just referred to, they can be a part of that French drain system, or they can be, again, those low-lying wet spots, they can be installed. And then frequently the catch basins are, instead of, in the previous slide, there was a perforated pipe with holes in it that was trying to also drain the surrounding area. Catch basins can just be used and attached to a solid pipe that's then diverting that water away someplace else. Another conventional solution really commonly used is a dry creek bed. Again, we've got a downspout up here. Sometimes these solutions, are great ways to try and move water off of hill slopes. So a lot of what we're going to do is trying to see if there's ways that we can divert runoff off of hill slopes, because they can be very erosive on hill slopes. So this was probably cutting into the soil. So by hardening this channel, can safely divert it to another place. Maybe there's an opportunity at the bottom of this hill to then infiltrate that water, which is the next step we would like to see. But as a conventional solution, dry creek beds are sort of just a more visual way. Instead, you could have just buried a pipe through here and connected to this downspout. But they can also be larger, capturing water, moving across a landscape. Some examples of conventional solutions. This is installation of some retaining wall and also French drain system going in. I'm going to try to, keeping an eye on time, breeze through these. Again, there is the recorded webinar and the PDF of the slides available, so we can hopefully get to some questions that Margaret is monitoring in the chat box. So conventional solutions, what do? We just talked about them. They capture and they concentrate that flow. Sometimes they cannot be effective in dealing with a whole bunch of water. You might have a lot of maintenance. I will say for all of our stormwater solutions, you will have ongoing maintenance that you need to keep an eye on, but some of these conventional solutions like French drains might be more maintenance intensive. French drain systems generally, when I've heard people have installed them, sometimes I hear they fail in as little as 2 years. Some people say they fail and they might last as long as 10 years. That's because they have those perforated pipes, and there was that gravel around it to try and prevent the soil from silting in. But because of all the small slits in the holes, they do tend to clog over time. So digging out and replacing that system, because it does have a lifespan associated with it. Outfall limitations. So you're putting this water into a pipe. Well, where are you sending it? Where are you directing it? Where is that water eventually going to go to? You need to think about that. Quality and quantity benefits. We'll talk about these when we discuss the different types of green or low impact design solutions. some slides that just show some of those issues that I saw. Frequently, those catch basin boxes can get clogged with sediments if the surrounding area is not stabilized, if there isn't good turf cover, if they're used in shady areas or areas where there's lots of mulch. All of that can still wash into those boxes, clog up the boxes themselves, not only the boxes, but even the drains. So the conventional ones that we just discussed versus these best management practices, I kind of call them low impact design or the more green type of solutions. So our stormwater best management practices we'll talk about. You might have heard of rain gardens as a term. That's one type of solution. So they really offer an opportunity to, what we're trying to do is capture that stormwater. So reduce the overall volume of that stormwater that's going to somebody else. With that conventional, we put it into a pipe. Like we said, that pipe is going somewhere. It's impacting somebody else in some way. So best management practices, we try to take our stormwater, use it on site, give it a chance to infiltrate into the ground. So as I just talked about those best management practices, one type homeowners hear a lot about are rain gardens. There's other things such as rain barrels, cisterns, permeable pavers, conservation landscaping, which is using native plants, vegetated swales, and then infiltration trenches or dry wells. Those are two words that sort of mean the same thing. Generally, homeowners, we talk about dry wells as a smaller scale for a single home on a lot. Infiltration trench is sort of a scaled up version of that practice. So it's just a larger size facility meant to take more stormwater, more downspouts, more runoff. It's just larger than those dry well systems. So we're going to breeze through a couple of these to try and describe some of them. Some of them I've left off. Again, you can check out the other webinars, but just in the interest of time to move through these. So we'll describe them, talk about when you might be able to use them in a landscape, and how are they going to serve you. So infiltration trenches, we just talked about, again, the dry wells are sort of that smaller size system. These two things work the same way. So we're just going to go through and give an example of what a larger size system, the infiltration trench is. So really basically, the infiltration trenches are just holes in the ground, which we either fill with rock material. Dry wells, there are some like do-it-yourself kind of kits that you might see at your local hardware store that sort of look like a trash can system. So it's just, it's empty in the middle. So that gives more void space. So you can take more stormwater if you just have a hole that's empty as opposed to kind of the gravel system. So there's many different systems, but these are basically just big holes in the ground that we dig to a certain depth where we can get better draining soils. For the most part, our soil scientists in our area, I know people are frequently, you go out in your yard to try and plant a plant. We've got that Virginia clay everybody talks about. But these systems, we think about them as trying to get a little bit deeper than just kind of a shallow on the surface. So about 2 to 3 feet down. If you dig down a little bit further, in some areas of the county, you're going to get more freely drained soils. So think about the functioning of a septic system. It's kind of the same thing. Those systems go in, again, about 3 to 4 feet down, but there's more freely draining soils down there that can take the effluent from the home and soak in to the groundwater. So infiltration trenches are sort of doing that same thing. Holes in the ground with the gravel just to hold structure. And a lot of times there are downspouts tied underground straight into these systems. So these can be designed, you might not even see these systems, you might not even know they're there. Some of them can be turfed over. This is an observation well. It is good to have keep some ways where you can keep an eye on them so you can monitor over time how well they're they're draining down after a storm, you can check the water level in there. So infiltration trenches, like I said, dry wells, sort of a smaller term for the same thing. They can take small amounts of hard surfaces, runoff from hard surfaces, like your rooftop, your driveways, and your lawns. Some of these can also be sized up to really take a large amount, a large volume. Of course, the costs increase as you get larger with these things. But here's an example of just how large they really can be. Really very large, you know, taking area from very large commercial settings, maybe parking lot runoff and other things like that. This is an example of an installation that went in of an infiltration trench. Again, so sort of the end product here, you can see digging down to create that. Some downspouts were routed in here. That's that observation well I talked about, to keep an eye on how things are going and draining down. But this was just turfed over. So the solution, like I said, you might not even know that it's there in the landscape, doing a lot of good for you. So some of these stormwater solutions can really be blended in to the landscape really well. Some of them can be more visual features, like the rain gardens. So again, this infiltration trench example, it used some catch basins to try and drain some low areas. It also had the roof downspouts routed into it. What are the benefits from installing an infiltration trench? So again, both small or large drainage areas. So that's how much runoff can it handle. We said some of them can handle you know, large parking lot areas, so they can really handle a lot of water. So we get quality benefits and runoff reduction benefits from these solutions. Limitations. As with any of these groundwater practices, you really need to have suitable soils for infiltration. So we said most of us are familiar going out and digging a plant, really having heavy clays kind of in the top layer, but these systems, we're really digging down. This one went down 5 feet. So pretty deep systems where we're gonna get freer draining soils. So I talked about at the local hardware stores, you might have these dry well kind of pre-made solutions. These again are those chambers that I were talking about. So they're completely empty, so you can actually hold more stormwater than if you just had a whole gravel filled area. Next, we're going to discuss vegetated swales. Some of the one of the homeowner associations that I received pictures from actually was referring to issues with swales, and we'll get to those photos later. But generally, swales are these channels built to convey runoff. They can also, you want them to be well stabilized, so you do want to have vegetation there, or even if it's too steep, you might have to use rock material because the vegetation might not be able just to handle the steep slope and slow that water down adequately. So swales generally are conveyance. They're moving that water along from one place to another. There are ways where we can try and slow down the water a little bit. You see kind of like these speed bumps that are built in here to try and allow some ponding and some capture of the water rather than just sending it like a straight chute. This is a bigger example of those previous slides. Dry swales, again, we talked about those little check dams or these kind of rock structures that can be used in them to try and slow that water down, give it a chance to filter in. So these dry swales, even though they just look like they're turfed, they've actually have this amended soil underneath. think my mouse, okay. So again, we need well draining, good draining soils underneath for these to work, but we can add in some more well draining soil and have these little check dams here to try and allow that water to soak into the ground rather than just speeding on down and through. So here's some pictures of some really gorgeous vegetated swales. Overall, we're trying to decrease the amount of the runoff, so doing some volume reduction, some capture and infiltration. Benefits of them, improving drainage, aesthetic value. This is kind of a green street solution here that's highly visible and landscaped. This one is might even be intercepting there's some curb cuts here that might be taking some of that runoff from the street. Limitations to these practices. They're really, you can't just plug them in anywhere. The infiltration trenches, as long as you've got a relatively flat area and well-draining soils, you might be able to stick a dry well or an infiltration trench. The swales really need to be, they're pretty large solutions with gradual slopes for them to really have that capability to slow down and spread their water out. Not very steep solutions. So again, not recommended on a steep slope. What happens when you do have a really steep slope and you do need to use this rock material? Before we showed that dry creek bed solution as a conventional solution. This step pool is very different solution. So again, we talked about how there's some amended soils under that dry swale. Well, the same thing here with the step pool. So we're really getting in and replacing some of this material. We're trying to have these little these steps, these check dams with these ponding areas. So as that water is flowing through, it's just not shooting quickly down, that it actually has a chance to stop and soak into the ground as it's moving through. So step pools, if you have a steep slope, you really might need to have that rock reinforced channel if it's a shorter and a steeper area, because the vegetation just won't hold up to the velocity or flow moving through there. Much of these are the same as we talked about with the dry swale. So step pools can really be used to recover from pretty drastic situations. So gullies or head cuts that might be occurring in the landscape. These systems might be able to be installed. Limitations, these can be pretty expensive design solutions, lots of earth moving and rock material and grading involved with these. Downslope connection, so that's just to think about, water is still moving through this. We're trying to capture some, but eventually it is going to discharge and it's going to end somewhere. So just thinking about where am I sending this water? Whereas if I get a large storm, I'm going to have a lot more moving through there than my system can handle. So where am I sending that? Making sure it's properly stabilized to handle the amount of flow moving through it. Conservation landscaping. One thing that we talked about, just using local native plants. So replacing turf grass or other invasive areas in the landscape, maybe even just areas of bare soil, and trying to incorporate native plants. Conservation landscaping, so again, using the native plants, we're trying to just improve the infiltration of the ground, getting deeper rooted vegetation than the turf. So hopefully if there's some storm water moving through there, just what falls on it, more of it is going to soak into the ground rather than running off the turf. A lot of water on a turf, especially with the slope, is going to be conveyed across that landscape. It's not going to really have a chance to soak in. So we're hoping with the use of these native plants to give an opportunity for those, for the water to soak in. You know, homeowners, it's a pretty easy do-it-yourself project for those conservation landscaping, removing invasives or turf grass and just adding in some native plants. You know, heavy shade areas, grasses or conventional lawn grasses do not do well in shady areas. If we have, you know, only about 3 to 4 hours of sunshine in that spot, our grasses really aren't going to hold up and do well. So Plant Nova Natives has lots of templates and different designs and plant lists, so you can really use some of those solutions, design it yourself, or have a landscape designer help install those. We do recommend installing those landscapes, amending the soil, trying to break up some of the compaction and including a compost material amendment, again, just to increase the water holding capacity of the soils at that upper level. Let those plant roots have an opportunity to establish and really spread through that area. Why do we like native plants? I talked about this a little bit. Our turf grasses are relatively shallow rooted. Our native plants and other vegetation really have these extensive underground root systems, which helps soak up that water and colonize the area, break up the compaction, all those things. So this is an example of a hill slope that was sort of informally terraced using these I think these were just fallen logs in the area, and extensive amounts of mulch, removing the turf, and put in some native grasses and other shrubs that are growing in here. Another example of this hill slope, and this looks like a whole bunch of golden groundsel that was planted in here. This area looks a little bit more like a foundation planting. Maybe there's some issues with invasive English ivy growing up here, and so it looks like native ferns and other things were included in this landscape bed. Again, a couple more examples of the beauty of the use of native plants. And another example. Again, heavy shade. We talked about turf grass is not growing really well in heavy shade. Looks like lots of wild ginger was used here in the foreground, and I'm sure different types of ferns as well. A hill slope that has English ivy here. So that was removed, and looks like maybe some Carex pennsylvanica, some Pennsylvania sedge that was added in, maybe some shrubs as well on the side, and I'm not sure if that's Heuchera or Tiarella in the front or what that is. These slides were pulled together, examples of conservation landscaping projects from Arlington County's Stormwater Wise program. Extensive area of front turf and replaced with this beautiful pollinator garden. Rain gardens, I'm going to actually, give me 1 second. Let me pause my screen share and let me look, checking how I'm doing on time here. Give me 1 moment. Okay. Oops, let me try and get back in here. All right, Going to try to move right along through some of these. The rain garden solution, again, using native plants. These are shallow landscaped depressions or bowl-shaped areas that we carve into the landscape to try and capture stormwater runoff, slow it down, and soak it in. So again, underlying, we do want to have well-draining soils and put some native plants in there. Sometimes we might need to remove and replace the soil that is there with freer draining soils than what we naturally have. Here's a good example from the side of what to see the underlying underground, what's going on underground. Again, the amended soil, or it might need to be replacement soil in those bowl-shaped depressions. Inflows and outflows, those are areas to think about that might need to be more highly stabilized with rock material, as you can see, because that's where the concentrated flow is going to be coming into those systems, typically coming through pipes from downspouts, and we want to give a chance for that water to slow down and settle a little bit before it enters these areas, so we're not going to have scour. The ponding area, so that's that depression, that bowl-shaped area we talked about. It could be as little as 6 inches, it could be a foot deep of this sloped area. We really want these areas to drain well within 24 to 48 hours. So we're not having standing water issues. If it's not draining within that time, there could be something wrong with your rain garden. So here's an example of when the soil was just amended. Instead of remove and replacing the native soil, it's just adding in lots of free draining compost. I'm not going to discuss the underdrain system. Those are for more kind of intensive, large scale solutions. Typically, for kind of a homeowner scale, the underdrains aren't needed depending on the amount of volume you really send into these systems. If you're sending a lot more runoff and more volume, including an underdrain is a good step. So here's something, a common misconception we really have, especially when we do our rain garden presentations. People see these low-lying wet areas in their landscape and they think it's already, you know, water's ponding there. It's already almost its own rain garden. Let me go ahead and put a rain garden there. Well, what we're seeing with this low-lying wet spot is the soils really might not be free draining. Again, the rain gardens, we want this water to soak through. We don't want it to sit and pond. So if you've got this low-lying wet area, depending on, you might really need to do extensive amounts of soil mitigation, but it really just might not be a suitable spot for a rain garden. So that's a common misconception we see. These lower lying wet areas, people think it's already kind of a rain garden. What you can do in these areas is put in appropriate native plants that can tolerate wet feet. So you can sort of landscape them in to kind of disguise it a little bit. But a rain garden really isn't a great solution. We have had homeowners do it yourself for the rain gardens, or they've been had contractors install them. They can be really beautiful. Again, we're using native plants, supporting native wildlife, all of those benefits. Permeable paver systems. These are different. They can either be permeable interlocking concrete pavers or a cement solution or an asphalt solution that are free draining. So basically, these are working by letting the water through the joints in between the pavers. Typically, we have permeable pavers installed in our area, so those are the ones that we've got pictures of. And then a bunch of rock material, so they are excavated down. Similar to the infiltration trench, you've got this area where that water is going to collect in this underground sump and then hopefully drain into the soils if we've done our soil test to make sure we do have well-draining soils underneath. An under drain might also be a part of that solution. This is an example from Montgomery County's program, I believe, over in Maryland. So that excavation, the installation of that subgrade, that gravel layer, and then putting the pavers on top. Examples of construction. We don't need to discuss edge restraint. So you can take downspouts onto these areas and have it discharge so they can take more water than just what falls on them during precipitation events if they're designed for that. Here again is another side view, the observation well, we talked about that before. Just a few examples of different installations before. It's a pretty large project. There is maintenance, like we talked about with all of these, with the conventional solutions as well as our green solutions, things you need to do to keep these functioning. Rain barrels and cisterns. Rain barrels are smaller sizes, typically about 50, 55 gallons. You can see a lot of these pre-made solutions that you can buy at home improvement stores or other things. There's also the Northern Virginia Rain Barrel Partnership. I'm not sure how they're doing on what they're doing nowadays with distribution or you know, those build events that they typically have, but I'm sure they have more information on their website. So cisterns are really large scale solutions. They can take a whole lot more water than these smaller rain barrels. What can you do with the water? Generally using them outside your home. So if you're a veggie gardener or have other garden areas, garden plots, that you can reuse that water to water around your landscape if you're establishing things, or again, vegetables during our hot, droughty summers, bird baths, you know, other general reuse. A little bit about installation that I'm not going to talk about. These can be really landscaped beautifully and either stick out or sort of blend into the landscape as you, however you prefer. We sort of talked about some of those. So limitations, really the barrels have a limited capacity. So we saw some pictures where people put multiple barrels side by side to sort of daisy chain them, or just get a larger cistern because they can fill up really quickly in a rainstorm. All right, this is our general email for Conservation District at fairfaxcounty.org.